Catholics will talk about the church forever. They can talk about the Pope, they can talk about their parish, but sometimes you ask a Catholic, who is Jesus for you? Ooh, they get like, oh, that's a little too Protestant, which is strange because, that's the center of our faith.
So much, Father James Martin, for being here with me. Jesuit priest, author, editor at large at America Magazine. I am a big fan of yours. I have to tell
Thanks.
you up front because I read the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything that you wrote, gifted to me by my best friend, Josephine, who went to a Jesuit school. She went to Lemoyne, actually.
Great. Good
And
Jesuit school.
I was just, it changed my life because you have a way of simplifying Catholic principles in a way that can be relatable in today's society. And you put forth actionable items that I think are really easy to understand.
Thanks.
You also talk about prayer in that. It's basically a book about Ignatius spirituality, but you talk about prayer. So I'm curious why in this latest book, Learning to Pray, you felt like you had to deep dive more. What was it?
Yeah, good question. So you're right. In the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, and thanks for getting that title right. People normally don't get the title right. I did talk quite a bit about prayer, but because of the length of the book, and because it was about more than just prayer, it was about sort of finding God in your everyday life, and a lot of the history of the Jesuits and Ignatian spirituality. There wasn't a whole lot of room for all I wanted to say about prayer. So this book, it's all about prayer. It's an introduction to prayer. It's different ways to pray. And it also answers a lot of questions, like the most common questions people have about prayer that I couldn't go into in the earlier book. So you can hand this book to people who have never prayed before, who pray regularly, or who've like sort of experienced prayers. So it's a much fuller treatment of the topic.
Okay, now tell me the truth, because the way I pray is I journal, right? And then I
Which is
start,
fine.
God, boom, 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 boom. Is that okay? Is that acceptable? Is
Totally.
is there
Yeah. I
a
mean,
wrong way?
no, no, I don't think there's really a wrong way. I think the only, I wouldn't say, there might be wrong ways to pray, but I think people that are trying to reach out to God in their own way are usually doing a good job. Now, I think the key for journaling is a great way of doing it. A lot of people journal. It helps them to, sort of be more precise. A lot of people, they'll pray out loud or they'll write things down rather than sometimes for people, they find sometimes that it can be vague if they're sort of in their minds. I think the key is also listening to God. Like, where is God active in your daily life? What might God be raising up in your private prayer? So it's not simply the talking to God that you would be doing in journaling, but also kind of the listening to God, so it's kind of a two-way street. And I talk about that in the book to try to demystify what it means to listen. It doesn't mean to hear voices or see visions. It's sort
Right.
of noticing where God is active.
Now, I think I've kind of figured out how to listen to God, but what
Mm.
does listening to God mean to
Yeah,
you?
that's a good question because I think most people think, well, they close their eyes and I don't hear anything, So what does it mean? I would say it means two things. One, it means sort of noticing where God is active in your day-to-day life. Okay. So stuff that happens to you. Let's say you're journaling and you put something out there, oh, God, help me with this, and someone gives you like an insight that really unlocks something. You say, okay, there's God kind of working through that person. That's listening, right?
Mhm.
But also in prayer, what does it mean? It doesn't mean hearing voices, right? It means, paying attention to things like emotions that come up. If you feel the sense of joy over a certain passage or memory that comes up that kind of heals you or that kind of gives you some perspective and insight. Insights are really important. Something just kind of unlocks desires you have. You might be praying about a passage from the Bible or something and say, oh my gosh, I really feel drawn to sort of being more forgiving or loving or something. Sometimes images come up. You might be having a very simple prayer period where you're just being quiet and this image comes up of whatever, like some, like the ocean or something. And you think like, wow, why am I thinking about the ocean? And it's, maybe an image of God for you. Words and phrases sometimes come up. You have to kind of discern, like something like, let's say you're praying and you're stressed and suddenly you sort of think of the words, the Lord is my shepherd. You're like, oh, where did that come from?
Mm.
Okay, well, that may be one way that God has of kind of communicating with you. So I think there's a lot of mystery about that. And one of the reasons I wrote this book, one of the primary reasons was that I think people, they hear about the fruits of prayer or what happens in prayer, and people are like, "What are you talking about? Like, what's supposed to happen when I close my eyes?" Right. So that's one reason I wrote the book, to let people know that it's you can talk about it and it's not that mysterious.
That's why I'm also a fan of the Jesuit way of praying, because it's different from what I was taught in Catholic school, very regimented and structured. So can you describe what the examen is and how how that works?
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of different ways to pray, as you say, and the standard prayers and the road prayers are fine for people.
Hmm.
The two techniques that Jesuits use that are most well known, I think, is called the examen, which is basically a review of the day.
Hmm.
And you look back at your day to see where God has been active. You start out with sort of placing yourself in God's presence. You call to mind things you're grateful for. I mean, a conversation, a meal, something you read, anything, some bit of good news. And then you review the day. You kind of go through the day and see where God was active, where you felt like you encountered God, anything that was kind of moving to you or insightful, any place where you feel God kind of communicated with you, through your regular life. And then you think about maybe the ways that you might have sinned or failed, because we're not, none of us are perfect. And
Hmm.
then you ask God for the grace for the next day. So the idea is, the insight that a lot of people have of saying, oh, when I look back on this period of my life, I can see God really clearly. It's often easier to see God in the past. And so that's what the examen does day by day. You just basically see where God is. It's a very easy prayer. And then the second one would be Ignatian contemplation, which is where you imagine yourself. You're talking about the imagination in a scripture scene, like if it's, Jesus healing someone or raising someone from the dead, you imagine yourself in that scene and you just kind of see what comes up, right? And what does that mean? Like emotions, feelings, memories, insights, especially desires, even words and phrases. See what comes up as a way of God communicating with you, about that passage or about your life. Or there's another even simpler way where you just imagine yourself speaking with Jesus. So I talk about that in the book, and also how to kind of discern, what you can trust that comes up in your prayer, because not everything that comes up in your mind is, a message from
Mhm.
God.
Now, speaking of which, what does God look like for you?
A great question. It varies, but mainly I'm praying with Jesus. Okay, so I'm praying with Jesus. I'm imagining Jesus.
Right.
But for a lot of people, as you probably know, they don't. It's more God, right? It's more the Creator, or it's more the Spirit, and they're not as into praying to Jesus, which is fine. So it depends on each person.
Now, you said in the past that before you entered the priesthood that you would pray, sporadically, and
Mhm.
now you have a routine way of praying. How has that changed you as a person?
Well, I hope it's made me, like more loving and charitable and all that, and closer to God. But I think I think what it does is it sort of makes it okay when you don't have these like really rich periods in prayer, right? I compare it in the book to a relationship. So let's say your best friend that you were just talking about. Let's say you see her or talk to her every day. Okay, maybe you do, or you text her, and so you're kind of used to the ups and downs. You say, yeah, okay, it's a long-term relationship. If you only see her every 5 years and it's for an hour, there's a lot like riding on that. And
Mm,
if things don't go well, you're like, oh no, we messed up. And it's the same with prayer. Like if you only talk to God like once a year
right.
and it doesn't feel like much is happening, you sort of feel discouraged. But if you're doing it every day, you're sort of like, yeah, okay, there's ups and downs, and I kind of know that. So it's maybe a little more relaxed about the fruits of prayer. So like this morning, I had a really nice prayer period. I just did. But the day before, I was like nothing, didn't feel like much was going on. I'm sure something was going on, but so that's the thing. But I don't get too upset about it. And I also do a lot of spiritual direction. And I know that this is part of the spiritual life for people, ups and downs. It's okay. And it's okay.
This is technically your second career because you've done something else in the past and then you
Yeah.
took it over. Do you ever like question your decision, or do you every single day wake up feeling like you're living your purpose?
Oh, well, it's funny. I would say that I don't question the decision. So I worked for GE, for General Electric, for 6 years, and I went to business school. I don't question the decision, but that doesn't mean it's always easy, Do you know
Mm,
what I mean? That doesn't mean like I wake up every day and I'm like jumping up and down but I don't question the decision. I don't say, oh, I should never have entered, or I should leave, or I should
right.
still be at GE. It would be like a marriage or something. I mean, the couple doesn't question the decision, but that doesn't mean that every single day is, like a honeymoon.
Right.
Right. So no, I haven't. It was a good decision. And I would look, business is a really good vocation. And, certainly for a lot of your listeners and viewers, business is, probably their vocation, their job. It's a great vocation for a lot of people. It wasn't for me. I was like in the wrong place.
Right. Now you talk about the importance of a relationship with God. And you speak on that a lot. Why do you think it's so important versus, just kind of living your life?
Well, right, exactly. I think if you believe in God, if you're a believer, right, being in relationship with God, I think would be probably one of the most important things in your life. You would want to know, where is God active in my life? What is God inviting me to do? And I think part of it, that's a really good question, because part of it is that sometimes people think, well, God can't possibly be interested in me in that way. It's sort of like God's way out there and I just sort of follow along with the rules, and then I get to heaven and God rewards me or doesn't.
Right.
But, one of the great insights of, pretty much all of Christian spirituality is that God can be found, as St. Ignatius said, in all things, and certainly in prayer. And you're kind of missing out. You know what it'd be like to take the relationship model? It would be like saying, okay, well, I know my parents love me, right? Or my best friend or whatever. So why do I really need to be in touch with them? I mean, I know they love me. So that's
Ooh,
enough. And we tend to do that with God.
you
And
don't need
we
that for
we
back.
yeah, well, I mean, the relationship is so nourishing, and
Mhm.
God is continually reaching out to us. And also I think if you're not in some sort of I would say spiritual relationship with God, things can get kind of cold, and it's basically just about rules. So again,
Mhm.
let's actually, the parent model is not a bad model. You would say, okay, what do I have to do for my parents? Well, I have to send them a birthday card. I have to call them on Christmas. I have to, whatever.
Right.
And if it's only about like following the rules, it gets kind of cold, right? Rather than, like calling them up and talking to them and sharing in their lives. And, God wants to share in God's life with you.
Sometimes Christians or other Christians in other denominations will say that it's quote unquote wrong for us to put so much emphasis on the Virgin or on saints, um, because of this whole conversation about idols.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about like the emphasis that we place on the Virgin Mary and the praying the Rosary and that kind
Yeah, I mean, and I understand that, especially from Protestants and evangelicals. It does seem weird sometimes, but I always just explain it to them as, look, we're not worshiping them, right? I mean, they're basically, they're examples. And I sometimes say to Protestants and evangelicals, well, what do you think about St. Paul? Oh, I love St. Paul. You're worshiping him. It's like, no, we're just sort of, put him in we venerate him. We think he's really important. And that's what we do to the saints too. We just think that they're kind of like our big brothers and big sisters, and they're kind of our models. And we believe that they pray for us in heaven. And I sometimes challenge people to say, well, what does that mean? I was like, okay, what do you think they're in heaven? They're like, oh yeah, of course. Well, would they be praying up there? It's like, yeah. Well, then why wouldn't you ask for their prayers? You ask for prayers for people down on earth.
of.
Mary, I think, I'm very devoted to Mary. And I do think that Catholics can tend to present her almost as if she's, Jesus's equal, which she's not, but she's an important figure in Christian history and in Christian spirituality. One of the things I love to say about Mary is that her last words in scripture in the Gospel of John at the wedding feast of Cana, you probably know, are do whatever he tells you.
Mm,
Which is that, Mary always points us to Jesus. But Catholics are sometimes, I would say they're the ones that sort of prompt people to think that, because of the way they, continually talk about her, sometimes more than Jesus,
I know
and
my
that's
mom,
wrong.
who is like the most Catholic person in America, she's like, you have to ask him. Sometimes when I pray the Rosary, I do it without the beads because I have to wash the dishes. So I count in my head. Is that acceptable?
Absolutely. I mean, God hears everything. Like people, people I think have very I think sometimes it's beautiful that they have these sort of traditions, right? Like I can't do this if I don't do this. But I think God hears all of our prayers. I mean, I think God is big enough. For example, God is big enough and, omniscient enough and omnipresent enough that if your mom doesn't have the beads, I think God will hear her. He's like, I think if he can create the universe, then he can hear your mom without the beads while she's washing dishes.
Okay, I have to ask you this quick anecdote about my mom again.
Sure.
We were at mass the other day, and one of the altar boys passed out right before communion, right?
Wow.
So the parents rushed up to him, and the ambulance came. They took him away. He's fine, right? But my mom's comment afterwards was, oh, "It's so sad that they weren't able to receive communion." I'm like, "Mom, I think God is fine.
But
I think God
she really
loves."
is Catholic. That is a very Catholic thing to say.
She's like, I'm like, under the circumstances, I think God understands. She's like,
Uh,
yeah, but it's not about God. It's about what they're receiving, the actual body of Christ. So can you clear this up for me? Because me and my mom were kind of not seeing eye to eye with that.
well, yeah, I don't know if I want to get in the middle of between you and your mom or to speak for God, but I would just say this. I would just say to your mom, look, God's mercy and God's forgiveness and God's love is way bigger than we can imagine. And also the other thing is, from a very practical point of view, I mean, I can't imagine that kid is never going to get communion anymore. I
Right.
mean, he'll be back next week and that's okay.
And technically, you only have to once a year, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think truly, I think God is much bigger than the rules that we sometimes assume that God is angry about. I mean, the poor kid. For
Oh,
Pete's sakes, what happened? Was he sick or?
he just got dehydrated and was
Yeah,
getting there
that
for.
happens a lot.
Yeah.
I a friend of mine told me that he was at a wedding once and the groom just collapsed.
Especially
Same
if you're
thing.
locking your knees for too long, that happens.
Yeah, and I at my Jesuit vow ceremony, which is when we take our vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience after 2 years of the novitiate. It's funny you should bring that up. There was a Jesuit who was on a liquid diet, and it was super hot. It was in August in Boston, and he
Oh,
he he turned white and passed out. And they had same thing. They had the EMT come in, and
oh no.
yeah. So at my ordination, about 9 years later, at the end of my Jesuit training, he was there and he said, "Don't worry, I've had a big drink of water." He was embarrassed. I mean, it just stopped the whole ceremony.
That's really
So
sad.
yeah, I
But
know.
you'll never forget it, and you'll never
Uh,
do it again.
no, no, and also, yeah, yeah. So it was pretty crazy. But that poor altar boy, I'm sure he felt really bad.
Yeah, and he's fine, thank God. But
Good, thank God.
interesting. Now, okay, Saint Ignatius was
Yes.
like this rebel before he
Hmm.
started the order, and he was into
Hmm.
girls. He was vain, and the whole thing.
Very.
And you guys kind of make that same shift of where when you enter the order, you kind of like go of like the societal things that are popular in pop culture and stuff. Do you ever miss it? Like, like a diet. Like if I go on a diet, I'm gonna miss the chocolate.
Well, I would say this: we try to give stuff up, and we don't, I don't own anything. Even the stuff in my room is, technically owned by the Jesuits. But by the same token, we're very engaged in culture, right? I mean, we run schools. I work for a magazine, right? I do a lot of media stuff. I watch TV, so it's that we're not like obsessed with it or like attached to it, but we certainly use it. I mean, like there's Jesuit playwrights and doctors and lawyers. And so they're I think the Jesuits, among many orders are the ones we're not monks, right? We're really involved in the world and it's all about finding God in all things. But you do at some point, like when you enter, you do leave a lot of stuff behind. Like, you leave your money behind. I mean, I literally gave away all my money to my parents and gave away my car and stuff like that. But we're super engaged in the culture and in the world.
And
So
you
I
seem
mean, look,
happy.
I'm doing your show, for example.
True. That is very true. Okay. So I am a very curious person. I'm
Great.
raised Catholic, but like I'm always curious about other religions. Do you ever think like, the Jews, that's they've got something going, or like those Buddhists, they listen, this area is
Sure. I mean, and also don't forget Jesus is Jewish, so they definitely have
right.
something going. There's a great line from a document in the Second Vatican Council which says something like, "We reject nothing that is good and true in these religions." And there's my path is through Jesus, but I mean, I have so many, Jewish and Protestant and Buddhist and Hindu friends, and I see that their paths are different, but I also think that the Catholic Church can learn a lot from other religions, right? And even, I would say not even, but including from Protestant denominations. So for example, we were talking last night at my Jesuit community, which you'll appreciate this, that Catholics will talk about the church forever. They can talk about the Pope, they can talk about their parish, they can talk about, like your mom, the altar boy. But sometimes you ask a Catholic, who is Jesus for you? Oh, they get like, oh, that's a little too Protestant, which is strange because, that's the center of our faith. So there was an article written in the magazine I work for, which I love this title. It just says everything. Christianity versus churchianity.
Ooh.
I know. And so for a lot of Catholics, they're more comfortable talking about the Pope and their bishop than they are about who is Jesus for you. And so that's something, this is my point, that's something we can learn from Protestants because they're much more comfortable about Jesus, and they're also better at like scripture and the gospels and stuff. So we can learn a lot from that. And I think they can learn a lot from us in terms of the sacraments and liturgy and stuff like that, which can be sometimes downplayed in some Protestant and evangelical churches, some. So I think it's mutual. I think yeah. And even like religions that seem to have little to do with Catholicism, like Buddhism and Hinduism, I think we can learn stuff from their practices. And yeah, absolutely, their
I love that
prayer.
answer because I think the churchianity is what has caused like this rift between, say, millennials, Gen Zers, and the institutional church.
Good point, because I think a lot of the younger people, they're not as interested in the church. Like they don't care, who the local bishop is. They want to know about Jesus and also, how authentically you're emulating Jesus. I think that's a very good point. But isn't that a great distinction? Christianity and churchianity.
I love it.
Yeah.
You're right that it explains everything. Now because you're open-minded in that way, you get a lot of backlash, particularly because of the LGBTQ or your stance on the LGBTQ community. And a lot of the criticism that I've heard is when like you kind of compare it to passages in Leviticus that also describe other things that need to be placed in historical context.
Yeah.
Like the fabrics worn. What is your response when people say those things, or like when people feel like you're less of a Catholic because you're might be more progressive or more open-minded?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I point out is, look, I'm baptized. I'm a Catholic. I'm also ordained. I'm a Jesuit, so I'm pretty Catholic, as Catholic as your mom. I would say I'm Catholic, and I'm not challenging any church teaching. And I think part of it is that people tend to not know, the context of these verses. And I will say to them, very bluntly, all right, do you think that a woman who has sex before she's married should be stoned to death? Which is the prescription. And they'd be like, no, of course not. It's like, why not? That's in Leviticus too. Oh, well, that's different. Well, what about, adultery? Do you think they should be killed? Right. Or do you think that someone who takes the name of God in vain should be killed? Right. And they're like, no, of course not. It's like, why not? Well, we understand those things differently. It's like, okay, exactly. So the only place where that people choose not to understand things differently or in their historical context or take things literally is homosexuality, which I think is really problematic. So I just try to like invite them to see the inconsistency.
Right.
But no, I mean, for the most part, people are very welcoming of the ministry I'm doing with LGBT people, which is basically just reaching out to them, and it has a lot of support of cardinals and bishops, and it's it's a lot of it's a small sort of group who's very loud. I mean, we know it's very loud and very can be very vicious, online. But I don't think that represents most of the church, because look, most people these days, even in very conservative enclaves, have children, friends, coworkers who are LGBT, and so they're just coming to know them more.
Okay, let's just say you've committed some sins.
I still do. I mean, we're all sinful,
Do you do confession on yourself? Like, do you?
No,
Is that a thing? How did
no,
that?
but no, I can't confess my sins to myself. I'm not, I'm no me laughing at you, but it's like, I'd give myself pretty easy penance. No, I actually, but here's something that might surprise you. I go to people who I live with, guys in my house.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, but
Embarrass
I,
you?
huh?
Isn't it embarrassing because you have to speak?
No, but well, I'm not killing anybody, or it's not like they're little sins. It's not like I've stolen $1 million and whatever. I can't even think about it. I murdered someone up the street because he said something to me on the subway. Um, no, I actually like confession. I know a lot of people find it very difficult, and even people who come to me for spiritual counseling, and good friends of mine will say, I can't go, or I find it very freeing. You go in, you say it. I think it's really important for someone to hear a word of forgiveness from a person. Right now, I know that Protestants might disagree, and they obviously confess their sins to God in their prayer, but it is something, as you know, as a Catholic, to go in, articulate it, right? Verbalize it. That's a hard thing to do, right? To admit I've done this, not like beating around the bush, but like this is the sin that I've done. And then hear someone say God forgives you. It's it's very freeing. So I like it. I mean, I really do. People, but I also go a lot. So it's not like they're like piling up, but no, I'm sinful like anybody else.
How do you determine penance? Like, how do you know I have to say 3 Hail Marys, but Sasha has
Yeah,
to say?
I usually try to make it something that's constructive.
Okay.
So if let's say you were really mean to your best friend or something, or someone at work, right? You snapped. I would say something like, do something nice for that person. That's often a penance that I would give, or pray for that person.
Practical. Okay.
Practical, yeah. And I think doing the Hail Marys and the Our Fathers is good, but I tend to think something that kind of restores the relationship a little bit. And sometimes I'll say to people, do something. It's funny with younger people. It's usually they were mean to their parents or something, or they weren't sufficiently grateful. And I'll say, do something nice for your parents, but don't tell them it's a penance. Like don't say I'm doing this for penance. Just do something nice. And that's a nice way to kind of restore things, which is what it is the sacrament of reconciliation. So it's reconciling.
We're about to enter into a season of Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, where we try to replicate the sacrifice that Jesus made. We've had a crazy year. How do you feel about people giving things up? What are you giving up?
Yeah, it's funny you should ask that. I have been telling people lately that I think that we have had a year-long Lent.
Yes.
I mean, people have given up what? Their health. I mean, oftentimes, the lives of their loved ones. I mean, their sanity, their jobs. So it's not like people are partying. Well, actually, they shouldn't be partying. But so I'm actually telling people to focus on doing something maybe more positive rather than giving something up. Maybe go back to giving something up next year. But just do something positive for a friend or for your family, or do some act of charity, or just be kind to people. But look, I think to say to people, you need to give more up this year. I think God has given us this Lent, of 2020 and 2021. And
right.
So that's been my suggestions to people. Do something a little more positive.
I love that. Okay.
Yeah.
Write that down. And
good.
Okay.
Do it.
There is a Jesuit Pope in the Vatican.
Mm-hmm.
Are you guys like woo 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 woo?
We were pretty happy. Although funny enough, when he was elected, he had a kind of mixed background. I'm not sure if you know this, but when he was in Argentina, he was not super popular in the Jesuits because he was very young when he was the regional superior called the provincial. And he even said, I was really, kind of rash, he said, sort of black and white.
There's a movie about it on Netflix. Yeah. I watched the movie. So
and he's honest about it, like he was kind of like my way or the highway. So funny enough, when he was elected, a lot of Jesuits were like, oh no, this guy. Right. But, he's, first of all, that was 40 years ago. So he's changed a lot. And I think he's fantastic. I mean, I met him briefly in 2019, for a meeting about LGBT people, which was just great. Just the two of us. And he's amazing.
Yeah.
He's like amazing. Oh, just very relaxed and funny. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you something funny. We spoke in Spanish, and there was a translator. Yeah. And my Spanish is not that great. And so I was reading him something about LGBT people, kind of like a page, like here are the 5 things I want to let you know that you know what's going on. And he corrected my Spanish. Oh. I said, do you speak Spanish?
Yes.
You yourself, yeah.
Yeah.
So I was saying that in many places LGBT people, which is true, are beaten, arrested, and executed. Okay, and I had to use the word ejecutadas, right, for execute.
Yeah.
And you know how it just didn't come out. I was kind of, and he said it.
Well, you'll never forget it now.
No, it's funny. I was really, he's ejecutadas. I was like, gracias. He's wonderful. He's just a great guy, and I'm very proud of him. And you know, I thought, boy, look, if he's whatever 78, whatever he was, I thought, well, look, if he's in for even 6 months, I'll be happy. Well, it's been like, I don't know, 6-7 years. It's
Right.
great. It's just
Right.
great.
And there is something endearing about somebody who can say, I wasn't perfect in the past, but I'm here to learn from my lessons. And
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll tell you something funny. We had an interview with him in 2013 at American Media and Our magazine.
Mhm.
And he said, I was named regional superior when I was 36. And then in the Italian, and we translated it, he says, that's crazy. So you'll like this story. So from that interview, there were a lot of really beautiful things that he said. And we made some holy cards that had these quotes on them, like whatever, like, you know, I'm a sinner who's loved by God or something really nice, like inspirational quotes. And I said, we need a holy card that says, that's crazy. But he's just so himself. He's like, yeah, that's crazy. I was 36. I was too young. I was really rash. And I hope people forgive me. And yeah.
But I think that's why that invites more people to
Totally.
come in and be a part of.
Totally. Yeah, because and I think, you know, truly, I think he's not Jesus, right? And so he has sinned. We've all sinned.
Yep.
And it makes him more inviting and accessible, and it makes the faith more accessible, because people think, all right, well, I don't have to be perfect, and he's not perfect, and you know, he's doing pretty well. So yeah, it is. It's very endearing. Imagine a leader saying, I shouldn't have been in that role at the time. That's we don't hear people say that. Like the big, you know, I made a huge mistake. It's usually like, well, you know, they sort of explain it away. That's a big deal for like a world leader to say.
But it makes them human.
Yes. Yeah.
The beauty of it. And
exactly.
I was going to say another thing that makes the religion more inviting is the Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything.
Thank you.
Great book. And now I'm excited to read this one. So I just want to know what it is that you want people to walk away with. I mean, the title's self-explanatory, but just if you can give us like a main overview of what you want people to walk away with.
Sure. So learning to pray is really, it's an invitation to prayer for everyone, because prayer is for everyone. That's the first line of the book. Everyone can pray. And I think that for people who think that they can't pray or they're not made for prayer, you read the book and you'll find that there are a lot of ways that you're already praying. And there are a lot of ways that God can communicate with you. So God wants a relationship with you. And look, if you're curious about it, there's a reason I say this in the book, that you're curious about it. It's because that's the way God is kind of calling you. You know, if you say, oh, I would really love to have a life of prayer, that's coming from God. That's a call. So all you got to do is respond to it. And really, the book will take you there, like, you know, from soup to nuts. There's pretty much every question you could imagine about prayers in the book. So it really is for everyone. That's the takeaway.
I am so excited to finish reading this. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and gems.
My pleasure.
I was what do they call those Catholics who are like in and out? Is it lukewarm?
There's lots of terms. Cafeteria Catholics.
Cafeteria Catholics.
Yeah.
I was one of those. But then I read your book, and then we've had this new pope, and so it's changed things. So I appreciate you all for doing
great. Well, thanks. And I would say welcome back. And you never really left. But then thanks for having me on your show. You asked great questions, and it's great to be with you. And New York misses you.
I miss it too. I hope you're enjoying it for the both of us.
I am. Listen, God bless you.
Thank you. Same.